Is he expected?
Well, under the topic for the MU1
Yeah,
code
there's only
update,
one.
it's his name, so I would assume he was presenting to us.
It's 5:03 and you are now live.
Oh,
And there he
Gary's.
is.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Gary, do you know if Stevens is coming or going to be at the meeting?
He's here.
Stephen is?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Either that or the S stands for Superman.
I think it works for both.
My Zoom
All
was
right.
my Zoom was doing something weird. Didn't want to let me log in.
Well, gosh. Is there anyone else here witnessing the meeting or planning to speak? Not aware of anyone?
I have 0 viewers on live stream.
What? I don't know how cool this meeting's gonna be.
Well, okay, let's start with a call to order, and I can call the roll. John Rafter, I'm here. Luke Murphy,
I'm here.
Dave Risberger,
Here.
and Katie Laparichu.
Here.
All right, very good. Our first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Are they acceptable to everyone? Anyone have any updates or changes they want to see made?
I don't think so. I think they're good. Memory serves.
Okay, and I doubt if we have any public comment unless someone's joined us. Unless there is someone here, we have one item on the agenda, and that's the MU1 code update. Steve will be the expert on that. And there was also a question about whether we wanted to, Katie was asking if we wanted to discuss the marijuana issue that has come up on emails. Any thoughts on that? I think, David, you were saying you thought it might be premature.
Well, John, let me just say a couple words. I mean,
Sure.
there's really 2 separate items for consideration. One is, and neither one requires action. One is if there is a desire to take action to make the sale of recreational cannabis in the city of Oneonta illegal. If no action is required, if there is no action taken, it will be permitted, as it will be any place else in New York State that does not take action against it. The second and separate issue is if there is no desire to make it illegal in the city of Oneonta, is there a desire to restrict the locations where it is sold, which would then become part of the zoning code if that was done. So I look at it this way. I mean, take one at a time. One is the issue about, is there any steps to make it illegal? I would look for, if there's no council member who has a desire to move forward with action to make it illegal in the city of Oneonta, there is nothing to talk about. So I would leave it up to any council member to approach John Rafter as the head of the legislative committee and state that they are interested in sponsoring a resolution, a motion, whatever it may be, legislation to make the sale of marijuana in Oneonta illegal. If you don't hear that from anybody, there really isn't anything. Now, the second question, which is more complicated, is if it is going to be legal, does anybody want to restrict it? Again, if there are those that, if nobody is interested in restricting it, there is really nothing to discuss. If somebody brings up and says, I would like to see it restricted and talk and have ideas. I would like it restricted to the MU2 zones, just bringing it up for an example. Then that's a starting point for discussion. So I guess the first step is to find out, one, is there anybody on council who wants to start the process going forward of trying to make it illegal? And if not, is there anybody on council who wants to start the process of going forward with trying to restrict it to certain areas?
Thank you. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I just have a question as it relates to the form-based code, just with where we are trying to go with that. I'm not sure that this is like the moment to ask the question, but I'm just gonna throw it out there that like, if we are looking at form-based code, and so I'm speculating here, in the entire city, are we looking at allowing commercial uses in residential neighborhoods? And if so, then does that complicate things with the cannabis use? But I think my initial question is, are we looking at spreading the form-based code to the entire city? And if so, does that allow for commercial uses in residential zones?
So the intent would be to expand the form-based code throughout the city. Just like any zoning, you don't have to expand commercial use to non-commercial places. So like what we did with this initial form-based code section, the MU1 zone, we didn't really expand the MU1 zone by that much. I mean, we picked up a couple parcels that should have been zoned MU1 to begin with. And if you look at the map, they're like clearly should have been MU1 to begin with. But we didn't. The way the code's set up with the transit system, as you move away from the center of the city, you start to see less density and like less commercial use. Like that's the intent. So the idea would be like maybe you have like a neighborhood like a grocery store, like we already have, like Hometown Deli, Center Street Deli. You don't want to restrict those types of uses, but we probably could say that like in a neighborhood you maybe don't want a liquor store. So I kind of see like a cannabis, a place that sells, marijuana. It's kind of like maybe like a liquor store. Like it's maybe one of those uses that we're okay with like a Hometown Deli, but we don't necessarily want like a bar. So like could maybe a place like Hometown Deli sell marijuana just like they sell cigarettes or beer? Maybe. But that's going to be like part of New York State's regulation. That's going to be part of, a bigger picture than just like our local zoning code. So to answer that question, ideally in a form-based code, you have some uses like the Hometown Deli. So that if you live in a neighborhood and you want to buy a gallon of milk, you can walk somewhere and buy a gallon of milk. That's kind of the whole idea. Do we want to entirely change our neighborhoods to be commercial zones? Well, no. So like there's kind of a balance there. And the idea is that as you get away from more dense places, that balance kind of plays out. Like converted store, like shops, like the Hometown Deli remain, but you don't build like, Hannaford.
Right.
Let me just add to that, Katie, I think that was an excellent question. And my sense is that there is never going to be a move to go to a code that doesn't restrict certain types of operations, businesses, whatever they may be, in certain areas. I mean, let's face it, a factory is never appropriate in a residential neighborhood, nor are many, many other types of businesses. So I think, while the form-based code focuses more on structures than it does on uses, as Stephen has pointed out, I don't think it's an all or nothing thing, and I can't envision ever going to a code that does not restrict certain types of uses in residential neighborhoods. In terms of, what Stephen said, what is going to be, could the Hometown Deli ever sell marijuana? The answer is almost certainly not. From what I've heard so far, and I'll know more because I'm going to the NICOM conference this week. I'll certainly learn more this week about it. But first of all, it's going to be a very, very stringent licensing process in order to become a dispensary. And I don't know this for fact, but I would be reasonably certain that dispensaries are going to have to be standalone. You're going to be a cannabis dispensary. You're not going to be able to get a license to sell it out of your grocery store or even out of your liquor store. It's going to be a very specialized thing. It's going to be expensive to get a license. It's going to be a very specific approval process to have to go through. So, well, I have not heard that definitively. From everything I have heard, I think it's going to be pure dispensaries, and they're going to have to go through a very selective process.
Now, do we have anyone else want to speak to the marijuana issue at all, or wait until we have more information?
I think I'm set, John. I was going to say something, but I think it makes probably more sense to wait until we have a little bit more information.
Yeah, John, the only thing I would say about it is I have no desire to make it illegal in the city of Oneonta, but I'd like a little bit more information. I'm leaning toward less restriction. I don't think we're going to have, I don't think Oneonta is going to be a ground zero where we're going to suddenly get 20 dispensaries showing up. But I'd like a little bit more information. Hopefully Gary will be given a little bit more over the next few days at NICOM.
Okay, so to recap, I think what Gary was saying, one is whether we would make marijuana illegal inside the city limits. Would that be the substance itself would be illegal inside the city? Is that an option?
No, use of marijuana is legal in the city right now.
Yeah.
And we have no control over that. We cannot make
Okay.
it illegal. We can make the sale of marijuana illegal in the city if we choose to do so. I have not heard a single council member make a comment yet that that's something they want to do. If somebody does want to lead an effort to do that, I would leave it to them to step up and lead that effort.
Yeah, I was just trying to clarify that we will not have an option to make marijuana illegal. And it's a matter of whether or not we will permit a dispensary or dispensaries to exist within the city limits. Whatever. And if we did that, we would not be eligible to collect the 4% or the 3% of the tax that would be derived from that.
If it's not sold in the city, we do not get any revenue.
Okay. And I was joking a bit about it, but the town could certainly do that, or nearby people would be able to buy is it just cities that can have dispensaries?
No,
So any other
No.
jurisdiction could say, we would like to get that tax revenue, so we will permit it.
that's correct.
Okay. All right. So, well,
And then as far as controlling where it's sold, it's no different than anything else. If you want to control it, you do through your zoning code, just like you control so many other uses through your zoning code.
all right. More to come. Anyone else on it? If not, we can go to the municipal form-based code discussion. So let's open for any questions or comments or thoughts on the codes in front of us. David?
Sorry, I had to unmute. This is a message or a question for Stephen. Stephen, will this, just rereading the part about the ZBA and the Planning Commission and what their duties will be, and I think it's very well written. I'm wondering, do we need to make additional changes in the charter that would take this into account? Because I know that currently there's quite a bit of overlap between zoning and planning. So you could have somebody go to the zoning board for a variance, and they don't necessarily have to go to the planning commission as well.
Yeah, so the intent of this is that anything that is in the MU1 specific district would trump existing sections of code. So like the sections of the code that are addressed by this code, this becomes the controlling document. The sections of the code that aren't addressed by this zoning document remain in place.
Okay, so we don't necessarily need to go back into the charter and make
No,
changes.
I asked Dave Merzig about it and he's supposed to get back to me. So, but yeah, as far as it's written out, the intent is that this section controls areas that are labeled as the MU1, and that the processes within that zone is the controlling document.
Okay.
And I had a question about that. The state has, the state law describes planning commissions and zoning boards. Have we put into this, I noticed that there were some restrictions, not restrictions, but protocols that were put in place about the zoning board's actions that put them in collaboration with planning. Is that legal for us to do?
So the intent there is that the applicant has to exhaust all processes of appeal before seeking a zoning variance. So what it means is that if you apply for something, you can always go to the planning commission, basically for like a special use permit, for like a site plan review. The intent is that we keep people from just making a determination that they don't want to follow the code and then going to the zoning board.
Well, that's where my question is. That's a step that's being put into, is written in here, but that put conditions on people going to zoning that may be in violation of state law. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of talked to Dave about it. I mean, I'm kind of waiting on him to
Okay,
give me some guidance there, but I mean, you can always file an application to the Zoning Board of Appeals. I mean, it just doesn't mean they have to grant it. The intent is that we give people, we're not depending on zoning variances, we're depending on processes within the code to address issues that come up with the code. So instead of me just determining that I don't want to follow the code, I want a zoning variance, we're giving controlled, like if you don't want to use a particular material, you can go to the planning commission for a site plan review. The planning commission can review it and provide written facts of finding of facts that show that you have a specific situation that would allow a different material to be used. The intent is to just keep people from, I just want to go to the zoning board and just get variances and variances and variances. Like by creating kind of a blow off, like by creating like a process where you can seek basically like without giving zoning variances, we're allowing people to receive permits. It's more of a discretionary review process than a complete exemption from the code requirement. But yeah, I mean, that's obviously something Dave Merzig will, I'm sure, weigh in on.
yeah. Yeah, I think that at least in my experience with zoning, people have been doing that. They've been going to zoning
Right.
for a use or a area variance, and there's no one else they need to consult. They can go to the board and await the board's decision, approval or denial for
So
that
you can
variance.
always write exceptions into zoning codes as long as they're clearly defined. So you can write in clearly defined exceptions to any part of a zoning code. And that's kind of what the intent is that if you meet these clearly defined exceptions, you can do A or B. short of being like, oh, well, we just have this thing written in, and if you don't meet it exactly, you need a zoning variance. So that's the intent of the process, and I mean,
Mhm.
obviously Dave will provide.
Good. I think that was the major, that was what I noticed and wanted to bring up, and that is the procedural change for getting an appeal to this multiple use code. So that's all. We'll get more information from David about whether we're on solid ground or how to be on solid ground for that. All right, other questions or thoughts about the MU code? Luke?
Just really quick, Stephen, I know, how comprehensive this document is, and just to publicly thank you for the effort and time you put into it. There's just a lot of work that was done. So thank you for all the time you put into it.
All right. Dave Risberger, do you have anything? Is that a hand or a fist?
Sorry, that was not a hand. Wasn't
Okay.
fifth either.
Power to the peoples. Any other thoughts or questions regarding the document?
So, oh, sorry.
I guess my question would be, what's the next step, John or Stephen?
We
Well,
present this.
ideally, I'll meet with Dave Merzig and we'll go over it thoroughly to review specifically the administrative part, like John brought up, for example. Once we kind of pick through it, we'll put a final, this is obviously a draft, so like there'll have to be a seeker will have to be done on it. We'll have to notify the county. I talked to Danny Lappin. We probably have to make a generic environmental impact statement or a negative declaration on the seeker impact, but that's a separate process.
Does this need to go to council to make it at some point in this, or where in this process, before the council votes on it?
The council approval would be the last step, followed by a public hearing, and then I would sign it. It's basically an ordinance. The one thing I do think we have to get allow the county to comment on it. So I think we have to submit it to the county planning department and give them an opportunity to comment on it before we go forward. I don't know that we have to accept their comments, but we have to give them an opportunity to comment.
Yeah, we would file a 239M form, and that would give them 30 days to review the ordinance, provide comment, and then we could choose to follow the comment or just do whatever we want. Which, I mean, obviously, that's the county's aware of our code update, so they've already looked at it, not officially, but have been involved in, seeing the draft. So
yeah. Generally, the county is only concern is on things that have an impact beyond the city in the broader county.
Then I guess my question is, we can not discuss this any further and then go through the process that precedes bringing this up to the council for a vote. Is that correct, or am I missing something?
I think that's correct.
yeah.
Okay, I'm very impressed by the document. I think that the only question I had was really had to do with that concern about zoning, and there may be other things that come up as the county reviews it, but there's no need to bring it up to the council or move it forward to the council for a vote because there are other steps that need to be taken. Is that correct? Okay. Any other thoughts from members of the committee?
Not at this point.
Just what are you gonna do with your free time now, Stephen, that you finished this project?
So, I mean, so basically where I kind of see this going is the way we've broken up the transect. What I'd like to do is expand what we've kind of got as we move forward into the MU2 zone. Because we've basically already written the code for it. By approving this code, you'll have already basically written an MU2 code as well. So we've kind of got like a pretty solid foundation to go that way. In other news, our CLG stuff is in front of SHPO right now. So we'll know hopefully soon whether we are a certified local government under SHPO. So that'll be some exciting stuff. Because from there, we can kind of work some of these center city neighborhoods with zoning updates in kind of conjunction with that SHPO CLG status. So yeah, I mean, we have a lot going on. It's a busy time.
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys want to talk about any of the issues that the planning commission brought up in regard to the form-based code, or if you want to wait until it's in front of the council, or so. I mean,
I'd
just as
be
something to think
curious about that.
The form-based code eliminates parking minimums, which I know will be a topic. The form-based code, as it's written now in the draft, does not allow for digital signage in the MU1 zone. And the form-based code right now, as it's written, has a height restriction on Market Street that there was some talk about. So I don't know if you guys have strong thoughts on that, or if we should still just kind of keep it as is until it goes in front of the full council. But I think those might be talking points at some point.
So that one was parking, and the other you were just mentioning, what's the best way of framing that?
Parking, there's a limitation. You're not allowed to have digital signage on Main Street.
Oh, digital signage, right.
Right. And then there's a height restriction on Market Street that was talked about. Those were the three main discussion points in the planning commission. I mean, the rest of it was pretty,
Okay.
Stephen, what was the height restriction again on Market Street? Did we put it at 5?
So I've got it open right here in front of me, so I can kind of, so what we did for Market Street was, so the original draft has Market Street at, let me see. We did 4 stories max in the original draft, and it was discussed to up that to 5 or some other iteration. And it was like 50-50. There was kind of a mix of opinion on that. So the draft you have in front of you would limit Market Street to a 4-story height building. Keeping in mind that our tallest building on Main Street is only 5 stories.
Stephen, why Market Street being different than Main Street?
The only discussion that was brought up was that we wanted the buildings on Main Street to have to be higher, basically, to be a taller central district. Due to the historic district, we're kind of limited on building higher on Main Street. So one of the things was discussed was on Market Street, we could, theoretically allow for taller buildings, understanding that our Main Street would just be, shorter.
What's the limit on Main Street now?
It's either 5 or 6, which is kind of what we've. Yeah, so we have a 5-story maximum height on Main Street, and that's just because we literally have no buildings taller than that on Main Street. The entire MU1 section in Main Street that's in the T6 zone is in the historic district. So you would have to get SHPO to approve you building like a 9-story building because it's all in the historic district.
Stephen, are you saying we currently have a height restriction on Main Street, or we will if we pass the MU?
So the form-based code would put a restriction on Main Street height.
Right now we have no restriction on Main Street, do we?
Right, you have no restriction on Main Street. So the intent of the code is to protect the downtown historic district. So
Right.
the intent of that would be, we don't want someone bulldozing a building and building a 9-story building in the middle of a bunch of like 3- and 4-story buildings. Because most of Main Street is not 5 stories. You could add 2 stories to most of Main Street and still be at 5 stories. So the intent is to protect the downtown historic district in the T6 zone. Anything outside of basically downtown Oneonta, we could set to whatever height we wanted. That's where it was discussed with the planning commission. Some people in the planning commission wanted to say, why don't we do 7 or 8? You know, make taller buildings outside of Main Street. The other half said, no, we kind of want it to step back. So that was one of the discussion points.
And I don't seem to recall any like super strong opinions.
There wasn't. That's kind of where we
Uh,
opted to put it in front of the legislative committee because there weren't really any, there was nothing like defining in the conversation that someone was like, this is what must be.
Well-
So that's kind of why it was kind of bounced out here.
Here's my thought on it. We currently don't have any restrictions on Main Street. How many developers have we had in the last 20 years that have come in and wanted to build a 5, 6, 7-story building on Main Street or anywhere? You know, I don't really, and this is just my opinion, I don't see the need necessarily to have a super high restriction allowing 6 or 7-story buildings on Market Street, because I just don't think it's going to happen. Either way, I
Okay.
think we're going to preserve the Main Street historic area, regardless of what we do on Market Street. Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
Well, how do you know that someday somebody won't propose building a 8-story hotel on the Westcott lot property?
I would love it. But
Okay.
you know, if I would love having some a developer that has interest here. But if let's say we go forward with a 5-story restriction on Market Street, that doesn't mean it's set in stone forever. I mean, we could always go back and change it. They could come back looking for a variance.
No, I'm just saying, I thought I heard you say, maybe I heard wrong. I thought I heard you say you're not worried about a height restriction on Main Street because you don't see anybody coming in to build anything higher than 5 stories.
Well, no, I did say that. I don't see, unless you know something I don't, you know, there hasn't been any developers that have been banging down the door or trying to do something like that. So I don't see it as an imminent concern about allowing that. I think if we have to change it down the road, we could always come back and change it.
Well, it's not imminent, but you can't change it after somebody arrives here. So, I mean, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now, somebody may come and say they want to build an 8-story hotel on, let's say, Westcott lot, or God forbid, maybe we have a fire and we have an empty lot on Main Street. Somebody could step in and say they want to build a 8-story hotel or building.
So what does the proposal on Market Street is for 4-story, and the proposed on Main Street is 5-story, Stephen, is that right?
Yeah, so when it was drafted, 4 stories is taller than anything on Market Street.
Right.
The 5-story limitation is only the downtown historic district. That's what's on Main Street. So the intent of the height restriction on Main Street was to match the massing, scale, density, et cetera, of the existing buildings,
Right.
which that's the whole gist of the code, is to do that. So the restriction on Main Street is meeting our comprehensive plan goal, which is to protect the integrity, blah, 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 of the downtown historic district. The surrounding Market Street, South Main Street, Main Street before you hit Chestnut, that's all outside of the historic zone or historic district. That's kind of like up in the air. I mean, that could be, you could say like 8. I mean, you can do whatever you want.
Right.
The idea was just to prevent like a Nader Towers type building from being constructed somewhere, like a 8-story building in the middle of a, you know, row of 3-story buildings.
Well, I mean, I feel pretty strongly about the 5-story limit on Main Street, just to preserve the historic nature of Main Street. As far as Market Street goes, I mean, I could go either way with what we want to allow. I mean, I feel like I feel like we could debate the height limitations on Market Street forever. Everybody's going to have their own opinion, and I don't think necessarily that any of them are wrong. It's really what's the majority want to put in there. I'd be fine with going a little higher than 4, though.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
But you don't need an answer today about that, do you?
no, I mean, that's just an arbitrary number.
Yeah.
I mean, you can sub that in and out. I mean, we could change it to 10 if we wait. It's just changing some verbiage.
Unless we look at it as if we have a higher number in there. And honestly, I don't see a developer coming and wanting to build, an 8-story building, but it would give us a lot of leeway of somebody that might want to come in and do a 4 or a 5, since we can't, if we can't come to a consensus of what we want to allow, it'll give a little bit more leeway in there. But
Yeah, I mean, that's what was with that's where we ran into with the planning commission. It was kind of the Main Street thing was fine, but most of the, the Market Street section of it was kind of a different, it was debatable.
and I think we're all, well, I think we're all going to have our opinions, and they're probably not going to be strong opinions, is my guess, because I don't know. Does anybody else have anything they want to say on height? Thoughts? Katie, what are your thoughts on Market Street? You always have an opinion. Wait, you're muted.
Of course, I have an opinion.
I'm sure you do. I'd like to know what it is.
No, it's just so in its infancy at this point because I hadn't considered it. I think that you raise, well, yeah, I mean, Main Street, of course, 100% agree with the height restriction. I think you raise a good point, Dave, which is that the chances of a lot of people wanting to build really tall buildings on Market Street are pretty slim. And saying that we don't want them at all, no matter what they are, is kind of, I don't know, like maybe something that we will regret down the line. But like you said, I could go either way for sure. I'm just trying to think, this whole time I've been sitting over here trying to think like what could go on Market Street in a really tall building that I would be mad about or I would be like really pumped about. And I can't see it developing that way. And I don't know whether it's better to guard against that or to leave it open to the possibility. So sorry, just more ambivalence from me.
I see this
So-
issue similar to how Washington, D.C. is set up, where they have height
Yeah.
limitations on buildings to not take away from the look of certain structures that are there.
So that's kind of the intent, is that you've got a protected Main Street that is preserved in kind of its current condition, so that we don't have another like Clarion Hotel get built, for example. The way I kind of envision this is like Market Street and that section of, kind of lower Main, like the, the approach towards Chestnut Street and like kind of Market. You could almost make like a tall, if you wanted to, you could make like tall, modern type, buildings, and it wouldn't detract from Main Street. And it would kind of, like you compared with Washington, D.C. Like I lived in Washington, D.C. and there was something nice about having kind of like that historic section. But then at the same time, you have large, tall buildings. I mean, so this kind of lower Market and lower Main becomes kind of like a horseshoe almost. It kind of envelops
Mhm.
like the historic downtown. So like I'm totally okay with that. I mean, I think what's important to note though is that most of Main Street is not exceeding or even touching the height limitation of 5 stories. I mean, it's
Right.
not. Like most of the buildings on Main Street are 3 stories.
Yep.
So there's not, I mean, in theory, if SHPO let you do it, or blessed it, or the Oneonta, theoretically, the Oneonta Historic Preservation Commission blessed it, then you could add 2 stories to any of these buildings other
Of
than the
course,
Oneonta Hotel.
Of course, the 3-story buildings, I believe, what's the height of each story of those 100-year-old?
So there's a measurement in the code, and it was somewhat based on those heights that are there. So you could still, I mean, you could still build a decent amount of height on a lot of these buildings and be within that code variance, but I don't think you're ever going to need to do it. So that's why the area outside of Main Street kind of became the main focus, is to like, do we want to make tall buildings there? Do we want to keep it, you know, in the same scale as what the existing landscape looks like? Because that's kind of what you're looking at. Like, if you were to make tall buildings on Market Street and like Lower Main, there's definitely going to be like a noticeable difference in like the scale of that area. Like, let's say you build 5 6-story buildings or 10-story buildings, it's going to be noticeably different from Main Street, which is fine. It's just kind of, how do you want to address that?
Right.
Like, do we determine that that's okay, or do we say no, we want to keep it point, and, you know, do we want Market Street to mimic Main Street, or do we want them to be very different as far as like
Street's
building
very
size?
different. I think it's only going to make Main Street more pronounced at how
Right.
quaint it is.
Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of that was one of the topics that was
Right.
debated and not determined
Gotcha.
in the Planning Commission. The parking thing was another one that was debated. The Planning Commission had come to a conclusion that it was fine. I think based on, you know, what we know, that will be a debatable, or a potentially debatable section of code. Because it would remove, currently, we have parking parking minimums that you have to meet when you do anything. So in theory, by removing those limitations, you can do more stuff because you don't have to build parking. But obviously people feel very strongly about parking in Oneonta. So that becomes a topic of debate.
All right. Anything else? And yeah, my only thought on that is if someone wants to build a multi-story building in Oneonta and they come to us talking about what they want to do and it sounds promising, we would probably revisit that. At the moment, I don't think that, I think as Dave was saying, I doubt very much that anyone's going to be coming in and wanting to negotiate with us. And if they want to build a structure of that kind of size, dimension, and volume, they could always put it in the town. And we'd have to really think ahead about that, where we'd want such a thing. So I'm fine with letting this go, and want to see if people are willing to break now, close the meeting. Okay, I'm for closing the meeting, and we'll meet again. We'll meet again. Take care.